Good morning, and today it's my privilege to be speaking, preaching the fifth sermon on the roller coaster life of Joseph. And the narrative today can be found in Genesis chapter 41. And Genesis chapter 40 ends with the statement that Joseph was still in prison. Now, I want to put this question to you. How big was Joseph's God? And maybe more pertinent question, how big is your God? And how big is my God? Well, I'll give you two answers to that question. How big is your God? Number one, bigger than you. And number two, bigger than any problems and challenges that you may have in your life. Now, let me give you the narrative. Some of you will know this, I know, and others of you may have forgotten it and may have never read it. Pharaoh has been dreaming. He's number one guy in Egypt, and the dreams, two dreams, and they troubled him. The first dream was he saw 7 cows, fat and sleek, coming out of the River Nile and grazing. But they were followed by 7 gaunt cows, ugly looking, and they ate up the 7 big cows. Pharaoh wakes up and he's troubled. But then he falls asleep and he dreams again. And he dreams that he sees 7 healthy heads of corn on a single stalk. And then he sees 7 gaunt heads on a single stalk, and the gaunt, or the withered one, withered by the east wind, ate up the healthy stalk. Joseph wakes up and he's troubled. And he calls all his magicians together, who are great interpreters of dreams. He tells them the dreams. Nobody can interpret it. Then, a guy who'd been in prison with Joseph said to Pharaoh, I know a man who's in prison who can interpret dreams. Pharaoh calls Joseph in. Joseph has to have a shower, be dressed, shaves, and he stands before Joseph. Joseph says, he stands before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says to him, I hear that you can interpret dreams. Joseph says, I can't, but God can. And he says, tell me your dreams. Pharaoh tells Joseph the dreams, and Joseph says, the dreams are one. You're going to have 7 years of great harvests, followed by 7 years of a great famine. And the fact that you've had 2 dreams, it is because God is saying it is going to happen. And then Joseph says to Pharaoh, you need to get a person in charge of this with teams, so that in the 7 good years they will store up enough food to cover the 7 following years of famine. And Pharaoh says, you are the man. So he puts a ring of authority on Joseph's finger. He puts a chain of dignity round his neck. He puts a robe of office upon him. And he says to him, you will ride in my chariot and you will be second in command of my entire nation. And people started crying out, make way, which is an incredible contrast to Joseph's brothers, who were saying to him, no way. But the other thing that Pharaoh did, he married Joseph off to a daughter of one of the pagan priests in Egypt. Now, some questions come up. Why did Pharaoh use a Hebrew? Another question. Why did Joseph agree to marry a pagan woman right against his culture, his nation, right against the call of God on his family? Why did, and you can say, well, he had no option. But the third question is this: why did God allow it? All this development taking place. Well, I want to ask you the question, how big is your God? Let me say a couple of things about God at this point. God's not narrow-minded. People, we can be so narrow-minded in our interpretation of what God is saying to us through the Bible. Secondly, God was developing history. God knew the development of theology that was going to take place. God knew that. God knew that eventually the Hebrews would be saying, we don't believe in marrying outside of our nation and our tribe and our clans. God knew this, but God was in the middle of developing history. No problem to God. Big problems to us. I ask the question again, how big is your God in you today, in the way you think and what you believe? And of course, God had no problem in mixing and merging the secular with the sacred. It's hugely dangerous to divorce the secular from the sacred, for this reason, that everything belongs to God. The kingdom of God is over everything. So, how big is your God? How big was Joseph's God? But how big is your God? And how big is my God? Now, all this developed, and it's not my part of the narrative to talk about the development. I'm just talking about what happened to Joseph, how he got out of prison, and how things developed. Now, there are 7 things. Don't moan, don't groan. I'll make statements rather than develop them. There are 7 lessons to be learnt from the narrative in Genesis 41. The first is this: God's faithfulness. God was looking on. He could see Joseph in prison. God knew exactly what he was going to do with Joseph's life. And the same can be said of us. God is always faithful, even when we're unfaithful, even when we misunderstand things, even when God's timing isn't what we want. Joseph, he had his own dream, and he's in prison for years, and then he's hauled back. God's always faithful. The second thing, the people in the narrative, in this story, were unconscious instruments of God. I mean, that's so encouraging, isn't it? That God uses people, God uses us, and half the time we're not aware of it. And we're instruments in God's hand for God's purposes. How big is your God? Number 3, people are links in a chain. We don't see everything. We'll be dead and gone, and people coming after us. I went to Bracknell in 1964. I was a link in a chain. People had started the church in 1860 something. I come along. I'm a link in a chain. The church is ongoing now. We're all links in a chain. You're a link in a chain. I'm a link in a chain. How big is your God? And then, listen to this. Lessons to learn from this story. People carry out God's purposes even in rebellion. I'm thinking of the brothers. I'm thinking of Joseph's brothers. They were in rebellion. They cleared Joseph out of the way. They wanted to kill him. They sold him. The people who bought him sold him on to Potiphar. He works for Potiphar. He ends up in jail. But what's going on? People are carrying out God's purposes even in rebellion. And you may want to write yourself off because you've made mistakes, willful mistakes. You may want to write yourself off because you failed, because you've been disobedient, or you've come to know God later in life. Listen, let's just take this. We are carrying on God's purposes even in those darkest times in our lives. Number 5, such people, the brothers, they're still responsible for what they did to Joseph, even though it was part of God's plan. Listen, it's part of the sovereignty of God. God will have patience with us. God will allow us to develop in ways that he doesn't want, and God will still use us. We're still responsible for the decisions we make. Yes, we're still responsible for the way we treat people. We're still responsible for the way we think about ourselves, even though it may be wrong. And God will use us nevertheless, but we are still responsible. And all this is going on. You can say, oh, the brothers, Joseph's brothers, getting away with murder here. Well, they weren't. And they were going to have to face up to a few things later on. So people are still responsible. Number 6, Joseph's prosperity was sudden. Now, it's just so brilliant. Say, this is so God. You think I'm trudging through life, or things are happening to me against what I would like, or you say prayers are going unanswered, but suddenly God moves in, because God is the God of the sudden. You can imagine Joseph waking up in prison this particular morning, and he's thinking that of the last conversation he had with a fellow who left prison, who became Pharaoh's butler. And Joseph knew that was going to happen. And he said to Joseph, to the butler, listen, will you remember me to Pharaoh? Yes, but he forgot him. And you can think, what is going on in Joseph's mind? How big was Joseph's God? And what was his thinking? But suddenly what? Suddenly there's a call. Joseph, Pharaoh wants to see you. Get washed, get dressed, get shaved. And suddenly he's in front of Pharaoh. And more than that, suddenly he's in a position of power. Suddenly he's number 2. Suddenly he's got all the authority other than the need to bow to Pharaoh. Suddenly it all happens in one conversation on one day. His life is totally, utterly, radically, historically changed. Suddenly. We need to believe in God's suddenlies. We need to believe that when we ask the question, can a nation be born in a day? The answer is yes. We need to be aware of the question, can God spread a table in the wilderness? The answer is yes, and the answer is suddenly and immediately. It's magnificent. There was a time, suddenly, when Jesus was born. Suddenly there were angels in the sky singing. Suddenly people have no faith, but suddenly they're born again, they believe. Suddenly their eyes are open. God is the God of the suddenly. Take heart. Answer the question, how big is your God? Well, he's a big God. He's the God of the suddenlies. What's the 7th lesson is this? We need to keep on working. We need to keep on doing the daily round and the common task. We need to keep on praying. We need to keep on reading the Bible. We need to keep on gathering with people. We need to keep on doing the, if you like, the bit of drudgery that's part of our lives. We need to just keep on doing the things, part of our routine, we need to keep on doing it, because suddenly, but we need to just do the works that God has called us to do. Let me ask you the question. How big is your God? How big is the God in your life? I'm going to pray. Father, I ask you to open our eyes to how big you are. I ask you, Father, to cause us to see the enormity of the historical context in which we are living. And Father, I ask you to suddenly demonstrate your powerful presence in us, for Jesus' sake. Amen. Well, God bless you this coming week, and may you know the bigness and the suddenlies of God.